This is Three Dog.
How can I help?
This is Game Sophistry,
a show where we dive into the world of video games and tech, telling you how to spend your money.
Isn't that nice of us?
Here are your gaming hosts, Andy Borkowski and Shaggy Dave.
The show's about to begin.
VGS.
Shall we play a game? Begins now.
Andy Borkowski here for VGS on Talk Radio AM 640, the show that looks at the world of video games, examine their ins and outs, and also deals with some of the meta issues that affect the industry. The last couple of weeks, we've really dived deep into that. You know, we've talked with people that defended the rights to have transgender characters in their games. You can see all that on our website, 640tron.com/VGS. We spoke with Naveed Kansari. He was an Iranian immigrant that talked about the Iranian Revolution and made a game depicting what it was like. And it was just a devastating title. Really, really great chat. And today, we thought we would do something kind of similarly. We're going to look at mental health and how it's depicted in games. We're going to examine this through the lens of game creators. We have Will O'Neill, the creator of the game Actual Sunlight. It's a game, an indie title that has a lot to do with what it's like for a man in his late 20s, early 30s, living in the city of Toronto, our city, and having to deal with maybe life not turning out exactly how he wanted to. It's a small little indie title, but it really spoke to me and the other people on the panel here. Our big interview after that, I spoke with Douglas Genteel. He is a professor of psychology at Iowa State. You might have seen that name thrown around if you're interested in video games, because he and his colleagues have written, I want to say maybe 10, 15 different papers have been involved in longitudinal studies all about how video games affect the brain. A lot of it has to do with little kids, but a lot more has to do with our culture. You know, how much credence we give to this type of media, and the science behind it is absolutely devastating. And of course, since we're going to be talking about mental health issues, the team is here and they're going to talk about some of the things that have affected them. We have a professor at Humber College, Zach Fanny. He's contributed to a lot of things here in the past. He's a voice that you've heard a lot here on the show, talks about movies and film as well. How's it going, Mr. Fanny?
Not too bad. How's your evening?
It's good. It's an intense episode today. Yeah, it's not.
I'm ready.
It's not the lightest of subject matter, but we all have something to say, and I think it ends on a bit of a hopeful note. So if you're listening, I'm telling this to Zach in particular because I know he has a weak constitution. If you're listening and you're getting upset and you're thinking like, I gotta leave. I'm just gonna leave. This is too upsetting. Hang in there, okay? Someone that has to hang in there, Richard the intern. He's here no matter what. We gave away his keys. He has to get his intern hours. So
yeah, I'm here, rain or shine.
He's got to be here. But you'll be sharing a personal story, and we want to thank you for that. And also, Mike the Birdman Dodd. He is a big contributor to this radio station. He's done a lot of stuff for VGS. He'll be joining us on the line. He has dealt with mental health issues and used video games to help him get through that. So we're going to get into that just coming up after this. We have to have a quick break, and we'll get right back to it. Again, this is VGS Talk Radio, AM 640. Andy Borkowski back here, VGS Talk Radio, AM 640. The video game show where we look at the world of video games, all the exciting things that you can enjoy. Today, we're examining mental health and their effects on people that play games, the games themselves, and how it's portrayed in the media. We're here with a bit of a packed house. We have Zach Fanny, professor from Humber College, Rich the intern, and Mike the Birdman Dodd is also joining us. You've heard his voice here with little features. We're going to get back to him in a second. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm not doing too bad, Andy.
Excellent. So again, we'll get back to you. It might take a little bit of time just because we got to go through it. But yeah, let's get to it right away. So guys, we looked at the world of video games and tried to examine some titles that portrayed characters with mental health issues appropriately. Didn't villainize them, didn't create them as a talkback, a little funny joke. We had a bit of a hard time finding some titles.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing, right? Is that you have characters that suffer trauma, but no characters that actually have mental health issues as characters.
That are just
right?
part of themselves.
Yeah, unless
you
it was
know?
a defining feature of their villainy or ability to support the protagonist in the game.
Which does seem odd considering how often we've been able to get past the point that one characteristic defines a character.
Right, you think of like the creme figures that are, transgender characters.
That's old media, right? We can do that now. We're better enough to do that, but it hasn't been there for mental health. But we did find some games that we thought were the best, including a very recent title and a very recent character.
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk? It's pretty goddamn stupid.
Well, I guess we're both disappointed with each other then.
What do you want from me?
Admit that you wanted to get rid of me the whole time.
Tommy knows this area
Oh,
better
fuck
than...
that.
Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
Absolutely. Bit of a monologue of the character Joel in the game Last of Us, a title that we all really enjoyed. Zach, you had a chance to look through it, and why pick Joel of all the characters?
Well, it's kind of a weird choice because he isn't suffering ostensibly from a mental health issue, right? But I thought the game dealt with trauma in a really interesting way, and that in the way he's characterized, you understand the loss that he suffered, and they deal with trauma as something that you live with over a vast expanse of time. And so the game is episodic in that sense, right? That it goes through the seasons. You play as Ellie. You see Joel gradually change.
You don't think that he had a mental health issue?
Not at first, right? Because it's about the loss of his daughter.
Yeah, the first scene is him losing his daughter.
Right.
I find it's like depression, like that.
But it's not a mental health. That's not a mental health issue. It's suffering trauma, right? So it's not an illness that he has that he's dealing with. But I thought that the way that he dealt with loss is kind of a similar way that you deal with mental health issues like depression, right? You never lose them. They never go away. And over time, we see Joel cope with this. And that's what the game is really about, right? It's not, he's trying to get Ellie from point A to point B, but it's also about how to reconcile himself with loss over the long term.
I think that's you really hit the nail on the head on that idea of whatever the trauma is, whatever the mental health issue is. It's not about completely overlooking it. It's about ensuring that you continue your life with it a part of you. And I think the character Joel, like you said, as the story grows, he figures out different ways to deal with this trauma. And in doing that, it makes the impact of the eventual conclusion mean more than just people dying.
The ending's great, right? And we saw Neil talk about that before. But when Joel lies to Ellie, you understand exactly why he's doing that. You understand that he's kind of getting through that loss with her as the object of his love, and she's accepting that. She knowingly accepts his lie. And so having that kind of ambiguous resolution, I really like that because it shows you that trauma is not something that you're going to, or loss is not something you're going to overcome or get past. It's something that you have to reconcile yourself to and live with. And I think that speaks to mental health issues.
And then from there, we're heading to the very next title, a game that is near and dear to my heart. We had to go to the post-apocalypse to find some unique and varied characters.
What is it? I don't see what this helps. She's dead. All right. I tracked her down. Southeast, near the river. They were selling her. Saw it through my scope. Whole place swarming with legion, hundreds of them, bidding for things no man has a right to. I just had my rifle with me. Just me against all of them. So I took the shot. Yeah. What they do to women, that's worse than death. There was no choice in what I did. It was more like being forced to watch something you can't stop. All this was only ever gonna play out one way. It still is. I don't have any say. All I can do is wait for it to be done with me. It was gonna be something. If I'd never met Carla, it would have been something else. I should have never gotten close to her. I've got bad things coming to me. You better keep your distance too.
That is the character Boone in the game Fallout New Vegas.
Lovely game.
Absolutely, Richard. It is probably one of my favorite titles. And this character, you heard a bit of him there, he plays a sniper in the post-apocalypse in the Nevada desert who had to kill his wife or see her brutally tortured and raped by these roving band of marauders. And I really thought in that game, you directly had to deal with someone trying to commit suicide. It was the moving factor in the title that pushed it forward in that story arc. If you make certain choices, he will kill himself at the end. And kind of what we said with Joel and with The Last of Us, the way that you're able to let him have that catharsis is to teach him how to deal with it, to teach him forgiveness, and to push him step by step. And
in both games, it's about solidarity as the answer, which is really, I think, key for mental health issues, right? Like, especially depression, as common as it is about achieving that solidarity, to realize that you're not alone suffering through this by yourself. And that's something that's
you're not to blame, and
achieve.
you are not. The blame isn't on you. And I think for so many people that deal with issues like this, serious issues, serious trauma, the blame seems to be on them. And I know, Richard, this is a huge game for you. So what do you have to say about it?
I didn't even know that he could kill himself at the end of the game. Honestly, I played his storyline through to a T, got everything perfect through all that. I didn't even know there was a bad end possibility.
Oh yeah, if you make some wrong choices, then it doesn't end well for him, or it could end really horribly where he goes out in a blaze of glory and just knows he's going to die
by himself.
Yeah, by himself, and he's alone. So. Well, it's interesting that you find these characters that are so varied and complex in these non-traditional settings. It's not the Call of Duties. That's just a war field that you find these things, or any of the other Uncharted games, which we might have because Neil Druckmann's on that. Yeah, it's not on that, but we have to go now from the post-apocalypse in the desert, to space for our final look at one of the most complex characters that deal with mental health.
So you're crazy. So what? That's practically stamped on the boarding pass for this mission.
It's just gonna hurt, or you'll mess around, or I'll end up killing you or something.
And?
And that sucks.
So it'll suck. But how much fun is it gonna be on the way?
I need some time to think, all right? Really, just leave me alone. Hey.
We need to discuss our relationship.
I said I want to think about everything. You know what it's like to think you're alone and find out you're not?
Pretty much, yeah.
Shepard.
I wasn't expecting you, Jack.
I was thinking about you, and maybe you're right. That I need...
It's all right. No more questions.
That is the badass biotic Jack from the Mass Effect franchise. Richard, I know you have a deep connection, at least to the franchise.
Oh my gosh, do I love this series. It is just underneath New Vegas for me.
So why is this character, do you think, one that has believable mental health issues?
I want to say because from a young age, she was kidnapped and took to this facility and tortured and just turned into this bitter, negative, borderline psychopathic, severely antisocial person who didn't know how to deal with all of this issue and technology shoved in her to make her the perfect, ultimate, strongest biotic ever. So she became this ball of hate and pain, and does experience this catharsis if you do the loyalty mission and everything.
The mission's called Catharsis. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Is it actually?
It is. Yeah.
It is. Then the whole plant where that was all taken place, were taken and kidnapped and raised or whatever, blown up, and Jack goes, "Oh well, now I need to go find something else to go do."
Yeah. Now your life has to have meaning. So I agree. In that one, you got a very fiery way of reaching that catharsis.
I like that one too, because it's about
beautiful.
It's about the reclamation of agency, right? Like in these issues, you feel so powerless, right? When you suffer from anxiety or depression, and with Jack, it's nice because it's a way of taking back her free will, of not letting those forces define her.
And we get a good look at the next step of that in the third game, where she's teaching at the Grissom Academy, which is like that biotic institute. It's fantastic to see where I'm this big awful person to, hey, I help lead children.
And seeing those interactions where she really loves her students, that was such a great resolution to that.
But you see that as a resolution to
again, the answer in solidarity, right?
Well, the answer
dealt with it, yeah.
Well, Mike, we brought you on here. I know you're not in the studio, but we're talking through emails. We talked about characters that found solidarity through their expressions in games. Now it's time to talk about gamers. Mike is a contributor here. He's done a lot of great work for us, but you told me that games pretty much saved your life, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I was diagnosed bipolar probably back in 2012, give or take, but I've always had mental issues pretty much throughout my entire life. I was going through a particularly rough patch probably back, I want to say 2013, give or take, and I was actually considered borderline suicidal for a while. And it was stuff like playing games like Mass Effect, by going through some of that and kind of having a different emotional experience, but also having freedom through a game like, say, Skyrim.
Okay.
Seeing all the different moral choices that I could make there. And I recently had a really, really, really bad bout of depression last fall. And one of the games that kind of made me think a lot about guilt, but also how I view the world, was a game like, say, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at a lot of the characters in there, just how Snake dealt with all the things that he's done over the course of his lifetime, but also through characters like, say, Quiet, who literally can't speak, but her story's presented in there as well. Games have been one of those things where it gives me an outlet to maybe live through another skin and to see other characters that are maybe suffering from other problems as well. Like, I know you guys brought up The Last of Us. That's a game that touched me particularly deep, and that's one of the few games I think that actually moved me to tears.
Yeah.
The way and how a lot of that game unfolded. But one game, this is probably going to surprise the panel here, that kind of made me think about maybe things aren't as bad as I think they are. Grand Theft Auto 5.
The comical, often outrageous Grand Theft Auto 5, really.
Yeah, because Michael, the guy who's literally
he is the press character, yeah.
handed to him everything. He's living the life, but he's unhappy. So he goes to visit his shrink to talk it out. And as the course of the game goes on, you can choose to visit the shrink, listen to his advice, and try and do the right thing and try and repair his family life. And I've gone through the game being a total dick, and I've also played the game listening to the guy and sort of Michael getting his life together. And I'm thinking there's something very powerful about that, because I don't like a lot of therapists and shrinks, and it was a game like that that kind of gave me the push. I was like, okay, yeah. I've talked with counselors, I've talked with people, maybe I should give this another shot than just have my friends and family do this. There are professionals out there.
Well, absolutely. No, and thank you, for sharing that experience. We do appreciate Mike Dodd, again, a great contributor here that's done a lot of work with us. Just before we hit the commercial break, we're going to have on, of course, Will O'Neill with his game Ultra Sunlight. But before we get to that, Richard, very quickly, I know you had a story connected with the games and how they're important to you, how they made you feel better in a real way.
Okay, so back around 2010, 2011, I went to school in New Jersey and was not feeling great, got depressed, dropped out, whatever you'd like to call it, and I had nothing to focus on. At the time, my dad was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, and that's a debilitating disease, and due to a combination of that, his pain, and his pills, he became violent, depressed himself, and I was suffering from, I guess, what you would call late age, like family abuse, and video games let me escape into obviously different worlds. Like I put in over 300 hours into New Vegas, which is why it's one of my favorite games of all time, but I got to experience different things and different lives and different experiences that I wouldn't have gotten in my own home, which is, I mean, it's great, but I wish I didn't have to deal with it.
Well, no, and that's kind of why you had this. So again, thank you everyone, the panel, for sharing their stories, talking about some titles that really affected them. We're going to have more with this. Will O'Neill, his game Ultra Sunlight, right after this. Andy Burkowski, this is Talk Radio, AM 640. This week on VGS, we're spending a lot of time looking at video games and how they affect the brain. We've already talked about games that are meant to share an experience of someone's mental woe, possibly find some solidarity in that way. What about how video games affect your mind that aren't meant for that purpose? Just general use, general play, the real science behind playing video games. We're speaking with Douglas Genteel, professor of psychology at Iowa State, who's worked in this field, has a lot to say about it. Thank you so much for joining the program.
It's my pleasure.
Well, right off the bat, what is your work in the field of video games and behavioralism in the mind?
Sure. Well, I'm a child psychologist. Yes, I know I sound older. And I study media's influences on children, what can be useful for healthy development and what ends up being not such healthy development. And so with regard to video games, I've looked at several different issues. Certainly one of the hot topics has been violent video games, but also how they can be used for education, or how prosocial games can actually be beneficial use. And I've also looked at what's popularly known as video game addiction.
So let's start with the violent video games, your work in that field. What approach did you bring to this kind of discovery? Because again, this has a lot of scientific rigor. You looked at this a lot of ways that pundits that come on this show don't. So yeah, please do share. What were some of your findings? What were your processes?
Well, as far as the processes, we've used several different scientific approaches. So we've done what are true experiments where, for example, you bring children into the lab and you randomly assign them to play either a violent game or a matched nonviolent game, and then you look at their behavior afterwards. And that allows us to understand something about causality, because they didn't choose the game they played. They were randomly assigned it, and so we know all the kids are basically equivalent, and if they behave very differently after playing the violent game, then we know it is something about the game that relates to that. And so what we found with those types of studies is that playing violent games certainly can increase aggressive thoughts and aggressive feelings, and also some aggressive behaviors. Now, the weakness of that type of study is we can't use real-world aggression, because it would be unethical to actually allow the kids to hit each other. So we use proxy measures of aggression. So we also have studied it with what are known as cross-sectional or correlational studies, where we give surveys, for example, to classrooms full of children. And we find there that the children who play a lot of violent video games tend to be the ones who actually do hit, who are more engaged in more bullying types of behaviors. And so there we can see the real world behaviors, but of course there we can't prove anything about causality. And then we've also done longitudinal studies where we follow the same groups of kids sometimes for years. And sometimes very large groups of kids. Like in one study, we followed 3,000 children for 3 years. And what we found there is that children who play more violent video games at the beginning of the study, they change the way they see the world. They start having what's called scientifically a hostile attribution bias. And what that is that we all know people who, when something annoying happens, they just, they can shrug it off. They say, oh, they probably didn't mean it. And we also know people who take everything very personally. This is more the latter, that when you get bumped in the hallway, you stop assuming it was an accident, and you start assuming the person meant to make you mad. And just that tiny little perception shift, you can see changes the odds that you might react aggressively. We also find that if they play more violent games, they start seeing aggression as more acceptable and more normal. And they also spend more time kind of engaging in aggressive fantasies that they would like to be aggressive. And, of course, those ways of thinking show up 2 years later that they become more aggressive because, of course, the way you think and feel relates to the way they behave, not in some simple mechanistic way, but that's, you take the way you think with you everywhere in the world. And so that's the way the effect happens. And as you mentioned, pundits like to make very extreme claims, either that games are destroying the world or that there's no effect whatsoever. And the answer, of course, is right in the middle there, that in fact, of course, they have an effect. If games didn't affect us, we'd call them boring.
Well, very fascinating. Why do you think that, even as a starting point, this type of media is so effective at changing young minds if it is violent? Why do you think video games are something that can do that? Just someone coming into it that maybe doesn't understand the power, that isn't a gamer, maybe they don't understand.
Yeah, well, I think, and I don't think it's specific at all to violence. I think this is why people are talking about using games in education, or games for good, or games for social change, that games are fantastic teachers. They do many of the things that an excellent teacher does. For example, a good teacher can adapt her lesson to, first of all, the level that the individual student is, and to the pace that that student learns at. But of course, in a classroom of 25 people, that's really hard to do, but games are fantastic at that. And then a good teacher also can give immediate feedback on how well they're doing and offer lots of opportunities for practice to the point where they not only learn the material, but they master it. It becomes automatic. But of course, in the classroom, that's very hard to do. You don't usually have that much time. You don't have enough opportunity to really give children the opportunity to truly master the material. But games, again, this is the way kids play them, so that they're learning. And the human brain learns effortlessly. You don't need to be listening to this program with an intention to learn. You don't say, I'm going to go listen to a radio show and learn something, right, and sit there and take notes. And yet, after hearing it just once, you've learned. And if you hear things over and over again, you learn them very well to the point where they become automatic. And so any content in games that gets repeated will get learned. There's no way you can't learn it just because that's the way the brain works.
Again, speaking with Douglas Genteel, professor of psychology at Iowa State, about how video games affect the brains of young people. Absolutely fascinating. And I think you touched on a great point there. The effect of media can be so subversive that we don't really consider it. You mentioned before that you look at other forms of media and how they have affected people. Are there any other forms of media that are comparable, or video games kind of that real hard jolt in your studies, in your examination, that has these lasting effects?
Yeah, in my studies, actually, I don't find that games are especially better at it than, say, television or movies. But there does seem to be something very different between screen media, where there's a visual, and, say, music. That the effect does not seem to be nearly as strong for music or for books. But when the visual is presented, then then it seems to be a pretty strong effect. But it doesn't seem to be much stronger for video games than for TV or movies, which is somewhat surprising because video games, you have to take the point of view of one of the characters. You're an active learner rather than just a passive observer. So there were a lot of reasons we thought games would be more influential than TV or movies, but I'm not finding that really in my studies.
On this program this week, we've spent a lot of time talking to people, developers or gamers themselves, that have used these tools later in life to deal with a lot of mental illness and behavioral issues. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but you examined also some of the benefits that games can do socially. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work in that field.
Sure. Well, again, and we've done this now in, I think, 8 different countries.
Wow.
All across the world. And we find that people who play prosocial games, so games where you actually are trying to help other characters, you're caring about other characters, you're taking care of other characters. And I don't really mean I help you by shooting someone else, although that is a form of prosocial behavior. It also includes the aggression. But even if we include those types of helpful games, when people play those games, they seem to gain in empathy, which then shows up in more helpful and cooperative behaviors. And again, for example, we saw this with 3,000 children followed across 3 years. The kids who were playing the most prosocial games actually increased their empathy for other people and were more helpful and cooperative in the real world 2 years later.
What are some of examples of prosocial games? Because for a lot of gamers, the idea that there's a game that doesn't have violence is a very difficult one to find. You know, we've spoken to a lot of parents that are gamers themselves, and they've had difficulty trying to find something to introduce their kids into this thing they love. What were the exemplars that you used?
Yeah, well, we allowed the children actually to rate them themselves, tell us specifically how prosocial the games were. So it's all types of games. We weren't giving specific exemplars. Some of the ones that come to mind, though, for me are like The Sims, where you are trying to take care of your family. Personal favorite in my household is Animal Crossing.
Yeah.
And if you don't know this game, if I tell you the plot, you're going to think this is the worst game ever. The basic plot is you've just moved away from home, you go to a town where you don't know anyone, you're forced to buy a house and get a job to pay off your mortgage. That's the plot.
That's called life for most people, yeah.
But the gameplay is you walk around, you meet your neighbors, they ask you for little favors. Will you carry this to so-and-so? Or, and so you go, you take this to that person, and then they give you a little reward for doing it. And so it's this community building gameplay that's really surprisingly fun. But so games like that, I think, would be truly prosocial games. But that said, you can take a violent game like, Call of Duty or World of Warcraft and play the medic or play the healer. And your goal is, even though you may engage in some violence along the way, you actually are playing with a prosocial motivation. You are trying to help your team. And this is the cutting edge of science. We don't actually know whether that's the same thing as playing just a truly prosocial game. It might be that by being a team-based game, it enhances the aggression effect because you're getting social support from your friends for behaving aggressively in the game, or it might be it totally mitigates it because you have these prosocial motivations during gameplay. So there's a good dissertation for someone listening to this. That's the cutting edge of the science. We don't know the answer yet.
We'll be back right after this break, continuing our conversation with Douglas Genteel, professor of psychology at Iowa State. He did a lot of work in the field of video games, looking at violent video games, prosocial video games. And after these words, we're going to look at the real dark side, the video game addiction, and how they affect people. We'll be back right after this. We're back here, VGS, talking with Douglas Genteel, a professor of psychology at Iowa State, all about his work in the field of video games, how they affect the mind. Before the break, we talked about violent video games and the connection to aggressive behavior from that, prosocial video games, and the connection to a more caring behavior, that there is a real effect this media can have. In either case, you're playing a lot. You're going to do a lot of things that's looking at a screen, and that can lead to addiction. Again, thank you for sticking around. What is the most dangerous thing in your estimation of video game addiction?
Well, I think the most dangerous thing about it is that we don't take it seriously. And I can understand why, because I didn't for many years myself. I started studying it back in the 1990s because even back then we were talking about my kid being addicted to games, and I always thought parents just mean that metaphorically. All they really mean is my kid spends a lot of time playing and I don't understand why. But that's not really an addiction. An addiction doesn't mean doing something a lot. It means doing it in such a way that it damages your life, that it is dysfunctional. That's a real addiction. And I thought, there's no way games are doing that. And so I started studying it from this more clinical perspective. And it turns out I was wrong. There are, a substantial number of children that are harming their lives in multiple ways based on the way they play. And in fact, in a national study I did with Harris polls, so it's beautiful, national study, we found that about 8.5% of youth video gamers 8 to 18 would classify as addicted by this clinical definition.
Fascinating. So again, we talked about your process in the previous works. How did you determine video game addiction?
Well, at that time, we created a measure based off of the measure that's used to screen for gambling addiction, and we hypothesized that these both are games, right? They both start as just something that's entertainment or a coping strategy, and perhaps they can both take on a life of their own and get out of balance and start harming your life. And so we used the exact way we would measure gambling addiction and just changed it from being about gambling to being about games. And the way the American Psychiatric Association says that you do these diagnostic screens is if you have at least 5 of the 10 symptoms, then you would count as being dysfunctional enough that that's clinically relevant and should be getting help. And that's the way, for example, depression is defined the same way. 5 of the 10 symptoms, and you're in the club. So that's the measure we used, and we did this. We gathered these data nationally, and I thought no kid was going to rise to that level, and it turns out I was wrong. And 8.5%, is that a big number? Is that a small number? Well, it means 92% of gamers aren't having this problem. That's good news, right?
Yeah.
But if there are 40 million children in the U.S. and 92% of them play video games and 8.5% of them are addicted, that's over 3 million children today are taking serious damage to their lives because of their gaming. And they probably should be getting help, but because we haven't seen this as a real mental health issue yet, there isn't help for them to be had. And that's why I think that's really the problem, is that we don't have the resources in place to, first of all, notice when kids are starting to have a problem and keep the problem from getting worse.
Is there comparable sorts of care to addictions to other forms of media? Because video games are, in relative terms, a new way that people experience fun. Are there similar numbers, in your estimation, your understanding, in TV, movies, music, the same kind of addiction cycles?
Well, so I have met some of the people who were on the American Psychiatric Association panel on behavioral addictions. And there's a Bible called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that the American Psychiatric Association puts out, that basically says how every mental health disorder should be diagnosed. And so for the most recent revision that came out a couple of years ago, they put together a panel of experts to review all of the research on every type of behavioral addiction other than gambling, because we already know a lot about that. And so they looked at the research on TV addiction, on sex addiction, on shopping addiction, on internet addiction, on video game addiction, and a couple others. And they decided that the research was only strong for video games. And so they proposed that in the DSM-5 that the internet gaming disorder, which is what it's called by the APA, would be included in the appendix as a potentially problematic issue that we need a little more research on before we make a final decision about whether it should be included as a true diagnosis. But they didn't include TVs. They didn't include cell phones. They didn't include, no other media seemed to have enough research to suggest it was a real problem other than games. And especially when games are internet connected, that seemed to them to be perhaps the most addictive, if you want to use that word.
What do you recommend then to parents, to people that use these kind of things for enjoyment, to ensure that this doesn't happen? Because anyone who's listening, they might just think, we'll keep them away from violent video games, but to know that there's a similar sort of concern as they would of any other addictive quality, I imagine it would be a little bit alarming. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm not a clinician, and I don't know that I really understand enough about how addictions happen, because I'm not an addiction specialist, and I don't know how they're treated very well. So I don't have, certainly the final word on this. And what I'll give you is my opinion. And my opinion is that this is going to be seen as a type of impulse control disorder, that you should go to sleep, but you just got to keep playing. You should do your homework, but you just need one more level. And so the good news is impulse control disorders are very treatable. You teach people, one of the ways they're treated is you teach people to start recognizing when they have the impulse and then put a break in there, and don't give in to it immediately. We'll check to see, okay, have I done my chores? Have I got my homework done? Have I spent some time with my family? If the answer is yes, then go ahead and play. Give in to the impulse. And if not, then go do those things first. And that's all about balance, right? It's not saying games are bad. It's not saying games, I don't even like using the term addictive with games because that treats them like a substance, and I don't think they are like a substance. I think the problem isn't with the games, the problem is with the gamer, that the gamer has allowed it to get out of balance to the point that it's damaging his or her life. And so the solution is to put it back in balance. And so I don't say you need to go cold turkey once you've got a problem. I think you just need to figure out how to play in a way that isn't harming other areas of your life. So how do you help your kids get to that level? Well, the research is pretty clear that when parents set limits on the amount of time that kids spend with games or with media in general, that's a powerful protective factor for kids. When parents set limits on the amount of content, on whether it's violent or sexual or whatever that family cares about, when they're setting limits on the content, that's a powerful protective factor for kids. And what we see in some studies there, for example, we followed 1,300 families across a school year, and we found that the families who set more limits on their children's screen time and content, this had this amazing ripple effect out into the future, that those kids were getting better sleep by the end of the school year, which in turn meant they gained less weight, so they were at lower risk for obesity. They were getting better grades in school. They were showing more helpful and cooperative prosocial behaviors in the classroom as rated by their teachers, which is remarkable because the teachers don't know what the rules are for children's screen media at home, but they can see the change in behavior. Mm-hmm. And they were less aggressive, again, as rated by teachers. And this is remarkable for two reasons to me. One is those are not the same type of variable, right? That's physical health and school performance and social wellness. Those aren't the same kind of outcomes, and yet the simple thing of setting limits on the amount and content of media influenced all of them. But the thing that's more interesting to me is that no parent will ever know they're having this effect, because you can't tell that your child gained less weight than he would have. Mm-hmm. You can't tell that your child is more prosocial than she would have been. You only can see what your child is. And so this is why parents feel they're powerless, because they can't see what effects their rules are having. They just see the fight that they have to maintain them. And it takes someone like me who comes in from the outside and can study thousands of families to be able to see, oh, those rules are having a huge effect and are really beneficial for your kids, and they're worth the fight.
Thank you so much. Wise words. Very, very fascinating look at the effects that video games have on our culture. And I'm excited to see where this goes. You know, we're in the first 25, 50 years of having games like this. It'd be interesting to see if these kind of studies stand up. And hopefully people can take what you're saying right now, take it to heart, and let it affect their behaviors.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I think, you know, the media are tremendously powerful, which is why we like them. We want to be influenced by them, but then we also want to pretend that, oh, no, I'm not affected, my kid's not affected.
Yeah.
Well, those can't both be true. Of course you're affected because, again, if the media didn't affect us, we wouldn't watch them. They'd be boring. So we want the effects, but what we need to do is figure out how to kind of maximize the benefits while minimizing the potential harms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining the program. Douglas Genteel, professor of psychology, Iowa State, looking at the effects that video games have on your mind, violent video games on kids, prosocial video games on kids, and of course, lastly, video game addiction. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.
This is Andy Burkowski for VGS on Talk Radio, AM 640.